if you look at it in a three-part chain, almost everyone has a weakness in one of the three, or if not all of the three parts.
Three-time world champion powerlifter.
Matt Wenning has directed over 6,000 troops for the U.S. Army.
Private strength and conditioning coach.
The next thing you have to ask is, what's the person's weakness? If you're really listening to what your body's telling you and you're reading and trying to understand what you're doing, you're going to start having an idea of what's right and what's wrong by 10 years. I've seen that over the last 25 years that 95% of the people have these problems.
The one thing I've seen, especially like with conjugate, like as I've gotten older and just like you said, like for me, wanting to get leaner and lose, the first time in my life, and I'm not your size, I was around 200 pounds, but wanting to get down to a little bit lighter body weight and not being as concerned about losing strength, but still maintaining enough strength where I'm, still relatively strong and feel good about where my strength numbers are. I think that, there are just certain things you get to a certain transition. I think everyone gets to that transition where it's like, what concessions do you make? All right, so maybe I can't deadlift as much anymore, but how does my body feel? How do my energy levels feel? If you're in bad shape because of a training session and then you can't do things outside of the gym, you can't play with your kids, and that's kind of a non-negotiable for me. And that's kind of what I've seen with a lot of people, kind of bridging that gap between both performance and longevity.
Yeah, and I've been able to sustain that for a lot of years. I'm 45, and I won my first world championship when I was 19. So that was 1999. So we're talking 25 years ago. And a godsend at that point was I was at a local YMCA. We were doing linear periodization. The guys I was training with didn't understand a whole lot about periodization or anything about conjugate. And then I started seeing these articles from Louis Simmons in Powerlifting USA on getting faster to get stronger and all these other areas of things that I knew I wasn't doing. And so long story short, I ended up making it to Westside Barbell and having some direct correlation with Louis while I'm in college and then in my graduate studies and bringing that back to Ball State. But the big thing is that when you get over 35 or 40 and you start having that accumulation mileage, especially if you've been insanely athletic as a kid, or you have just natural wear and tear, it's not what you can do, it's what your body can tolerate consistently. And that's where Conjugate System really has a grasp on rotating the pressures, especially if you have the right equipment, that reducing axial loading to where you're getting the same muscle activation without the spinal loading. Not to say that spinal loading isn't important, but if all of your exercises, which you and I both see a ton, people want to do conjugate, but they only have a barbell. There's only so many exercises that you can select without having some type of specialization movements. And that's where I designed my bell squat and cut it apart, put it back together probably 100 times to get the exact perfect loading on it to where it was a 1-to-1 ratio. So if I could squat 800 on my belt squat, I could squat 800 with a bar. And that was exactly how it came about. But the machine. But, if you look at like programming in general, you can't train the same pressure gradient at the exact same position all the time. It has to be rotated to be able to be consistently done without mileage. And that's where I think a lot of the fitness industry is not hitting its nail on the head right now, is everybody's looking at muscle performance versus joint longevity and the ability for the body to sustain high workloads for long periods of time. And I think you see that because most people stay in their fitness range for anywhere from, and I'm being generous, probably 6 months. And then they start chipping off and missing workouts and doing this and that. They never get to their full potential. And that's where I think conjugate can become a hard sell to people because it's a long-term adaptation,
Yeah, and that's a great point. I feel like there are so many different nuances to consider. And I think, spinal loading is a good one. I think it's a good topic for conversation because there's obviously, you've probably seen there's a lot more. There's kind of like two camps now. And I'm sure you've seen this where there's the camp that's, always maintain a neutral spine under all circumstances. Then there's the other side that's, I think, they refer to the other ones as like the glass back community. They're afraid to round their backs. And, it's kind of funny. I think at some point you have to, assess the wear and tear on your body, like you said. if you moved a lot of loads over the course of your career, and maybe, again, maybe you're like you're a power lifter, a high level power lifter, you have to really assess the wear and tear that exists there, because, I don't think it's the one thing that breaks, or the one gust of wind that breaks the branch on the tree. I think it's the wind repeated over the years that breaks it. So yes, you can round your back, and I did it for years where I got away with it and I never had any issues. Wasn't until my 30s that all that wear and tear started to pile up.
Yeah.
Now, if I round my back at all, and whoever sees this, they want to call me whatever they want, I don't care. But I know what puts me in a position to feel good and to be able to actually use my fitness. If I'm hurt and I can't train, then I'm no good to anyone. And
Right.
that's the kind of the position that I've come to, especially with a lot of people that have been training 10 plus years, 15 years, and they're at a point where, yes, they still want to be strong. They still want to push themselves, but we have to be very much mindful of the exercise selection. We can't necessarily, I see the big push now with like Zercher squats from the floor, like a Zercher deadlift from the floor. And I mean, even good mornings, I think that there's some application there, but I do think that, biomechanically, when you start bringing the load further away from center of mass, you start essentially changing the gravity line. There are things that do happen. And I think Stu McGill, on that podcast that he did, I agreed with a lot of what he said. And, I think that there's a case by case. You might deadlift your entire life and never have an issue. But then there might be that one person that does it the one time and has an issue. Or maybe there's someone like me that's been doing it a long time and then gets to a point where it's like, you know what? I just intuitively feel like this probably isn't a good match for me anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rotating exercises based on what you can tolerate is a huge factor in the training. But, in most people's traditional sense of periodization or the type of workouts that they're doing, what you find is that they have a very rigid and only a very small library of movements that they can select from. But like bringing it back to your original point on Zercher squats, we both know maybe people on one hand that are mobile enough to do a Zercher squat from the floor and maintain a decent back posture. And I think the problem becomes is that, most people start, and why this is a problem, in my opinion, is most people start with legs that are so many times stronger than their backs. And then they create this motor pattern that's incorrect. And over the short period of time, the body tolerates it. But then as it gets more wear and tear in those poor motor positions, because they didn't fix the weaknesses to begin with, meaning the postural muscles of the spine need to get a lot of action before the legs get super strong. Because I've never run into a lifter that their legs weren't strong enough that their back couldn't hold it. Meaning, like, the back is usually always a limiting factor. The trunk is, why can people leg press 5 times what they can squat?
Yeah.
And the reason is because it's not involving their back. It's not involving anything that's making them have to balance and brace. They can just lay there and do it. So with that being said, your initial training protocol, and like I know you've seen my workouts on Train Heroic, almost all of the warm-ups and accessories are based on trunk core lock-in stabilization and fixing weak motor patterns. And I've seen that over the last 25 years that 95% of the people have these problems, So I know you and I both get dinged somewhat on the internet. They have the same answer for the same thing. Matt always says triceps are the weakest link. And well, the reason for that is because everybody thought that the bench press when they grew up was a chest exercise. And the triceps are the limiting factor for 90% of the people I've seen. So if I've never done a personal assessment on you and I'm just going to shoot a 3-pointer with the lights off, I'm going with triceps.
Well, and that's just that you're writing a program for the masses too. You're not writing a program for me.
Right.
You're writing a program for, potentially thousands of people. So if you're going to go with just the greatest good for the greatest number, triceps probably be a good place to start where we can start seeing some carryover. And I know that's why, people that use our programs, they get 8, 12 weeks into it and it's like, holy shit, I'm hitting lifetime PRs. And we actually didn't bench. I'm benching. I get people that are always terrified. Oh, we didn't back squat for 12 weeks. But then they hit a lifetime PR in their back squat. I mean, that happens all the time. I mean, we've got about 150, 200 screenshots of people saying, hey, I didn't back squat for 12 weeks, but I hit a lifetime PR. It's like, well, yes. I mean, there's more to this than just back squatting. There's more to it than just bench pressing. And if that's your goal, then at some point you need to start assessing where the limitations lie. And if you just throw out again, you throw a dart on the board and you say, where's the limitation? Well, if we hit the triceps pretty hard, or,
Yeah.
alternatively, if we look at kind of more accessory based exercises to bring that up, then
Yeah.
maybe we'll see a carryover.
Yeah. I mean, that's the big thing is like, case into your point, we did Tuesday, we did a max effort deadlift, and we haven't really deadlifted probably since May with some of these guys at the firehouse. And some of them, we were just doing a 3RM instead of a 1RM. Some of them pulled their 1RM for 3 reps and they haven't been deadlifting. And they started to realize that you don't need to specifically train the exact lift in order to get better at it. You need to know which components of those muscle groups are not doing what they're supposed to do, and then bring them back in and build the puzzle again. And automatically everything fires. And that's where I think is difficult for a lot of people to understand. Is like, how do I get better at squatting and deadlifting without doing those movements? When I pulled 822, which was my best deadlifting competition, I never touched anything over 750 in the gym, ever in training at all. And the last cycle that I did that in, I only pulled with a straight bar in my competition stance 3 times in 12 weeks. Everything else, and those were assessment tools. So what I think, and that's something that I think you and I can agree on, is you use the compound movements like squat, benching, and deadlifting. Let's just say that in a powerlifting sense. Those are not only numbers as PRs, they're also assessment tools. So when somebody goes to a 1RM, I'm not looking for the weight on the bar. I'm looking at their technical mastery of that weight. That's going to give me the big chunk of the next 12, 15 weeks of what needs to happen in order for those areas to be fixed. And it's not always just doing the main lift. It's giving the other pieces.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think that's such a valuable lesson that I learned from Louis, and the times I went to Westside, I think every time I went to Westside, Louis told me really the same thing. It was like, got in the reverse hyper and he's like, you've got no ass. I was all hamstrings. I could do inverse leg curls for days, with no weight, and always had, hamstrings. And, I trained at a conjugate based gym as a young athlete. So I was lucky to have that exposure to the system very early, and, to be doing things like reverse hypers and glute ham raises. But needless to say, there was a lot that we weren't doing. We weren't dragging the sled. We weren't doing a lot of direct glute work. We didn't know how to do the reverse hyper. We had a reverse hyper. We didn't really know how to do it. And when I went to Westside, it was like, Louis is like, you got no ass. He put the other, guy Joe on it, and he's like, watch him do it. And, how he's able to really contract his glutes. And I'm like, wow, I never thought about that. And I honestly didn't have the motor control to contract my glutes literally for me, it was just a swing. And I'm sure, there's some benefits there in terms of just doing it, but there was no activity in my glute complex while doing a reverse hyper. And again, it's one of those things that you make a small adjustment and all of a sudden now, you're working musculature that probably hasn't been worked nearly enough. And maybe that was the limitation for me along why, the times I did hurt my back, deadlifting or heavy squatting.
Well, if you look at it in a 3-part chain, almost everyone has a weakness in one of the 3, or if not all of the 3 parts. So they either have a quadricep to hamstring ratio imbalance, their glutes don't fire, which was your problem, or their lower back isn't conditioned enough and controlled enough neurologically to be able to stay in position when things get shitty. Those 3 things, almost all of them or one of them, is always the issue with the lower back, or a lower body stuck lift like a squat or a deadlift. I would say 95% of the time, one of those 3 muscles is the limiting factor. Somebody has done exercises for the posterior chain, but their neurological connection's so good in their hamstrings that, like the hamstrings overpower everything. Then you have guys that might be, I don't see it a lot, but guys that are glute dominant, then their hamstrings don't get work because their glutes take over everything. And then lower back is usually a postural problem. If their lower back's taken over, and it's because they're usually quad dominant.
Right.
So everything shifts over to lower back and lumbar when they go into maximal strain, which is a technical breakdown. So once you get the hamstring and the glute, let's say the lower back is a dominant posterior chain muscle because of the quadricep, you get the glutes and hamstrings to fire. Now all of a sudden those lifts start to show improvement from really not even doing them.
Exactly.
And so that's where skilled coaches like you and I come in and see, hey, you might be doing reverse hypers, but if you're not doing them the right way, it's a big difference between having a pro guy stand there and show you what's going on versus you're just walking through the movements.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you remember this, but I wanted to share this story. It's to me a a nice story along kind of my career as a coach. But I don't know if you remember back in like 2000, I think it was around 2013 or 14. I reached out to you and you wrote my program.
Maybe.
Do you remember that?
It's
I owned a
been,
CrossFit gym. So
yeah.
I remember watching one of your talks on the, it was on the NSCA's website. And
Okay.
I've had, I've had a CSCS for since almost a decade now. And I
Yeah.
remember just watching some of the videos on there. And I remember watching your video. And obviously, I was using the Conjugate System at my gym. And I was, I hadn't been programming for other CrossFit gyms yet. But needless to say, I was like, you know what, I was at the point where I needed a coach. And I reached out to you. You wrote me an 8-week program. And I don't know, maybe you don't remember it, but it was funny because you told me, I remember you telling me, number one, I was overtrained. And number two, you had me doing a tempo reverse hyper with no weight.
Yeah.
So funny enough, I didn't tell you, Louis told me I had no, actually, Louis hadn't even told me that yet. It hadn't happened yet. So he had me doing a tempo reverse hyper, literally with no weight, like a 3-second, tempo, just again, going through range of motion and doing single leg reverse hypers and doing just an ungodly amount of sled drags with heavy, heavy, heavy loads, 12 trips with the sled with super, super heavy loads. So it's just kind of funny. I think, I wanted to share that story. I wasn't sure if you remembered or not, but it's something I remembered. And I think, the audience will appreciate that because, one of the things I always say to everyone, the best way you learn about programming is by doing programming. What a novel idea. I didn't learn it in undergrad or postgrad. I learned it from being in the trenches, from doing it, from experimenting, from being my own guinea pig, from doing Wenning warm-ups, from doing tempo, all these things that I wouldn't otherwise have done. Being exposed to people like you, people like Joe DeFranco, people like Chad Waterbury and Christian Tibbett, and all these great guys that have a ton of great information. That's where we extract some really, really great lessons. And I think that, for anyone that's listening, that's why you and I do what we do. That's why we write programs the way we do for the masses. And again, think about kind of the greatest good. So if the greatest good is you want to be a combination of strong and have longevity, then we can help you do that. And I think that at the end of the day, the experience combined, I mean, it's tough to match that. And that's why, it's one of those things I always say to people. It's like, how much time do you have to put into writing a program? Probably not as much time as I do because I do this for a living. So chances are that, I can put you in a better place than you can. And I think that it's just, again, coaches needing coaches is something that is understated.
Well, it's this experience. I mean, by the time I had wrote your program in say 2013 or 14, I had already been using the Conjugate System for like 15 years.
Right.
So whatever you sent me as a assessment video and I saw as technical breakdown is why you were going back and doing those exercises. Was because we're trying to find a way to satellite help you, force you to use those weak muscle groups. You know what I mean? But what I do now with my stuff, so I have online coaches that they'll do assessments via like online, like what we're doing now, but they'll do that. But like if somebody wants online coached by me now personally, they have to fly in and get an in-person assessment to pick up the same stuff that Louis picked up when you went and visited him, because there's only so much you can see in a video. A video is not 3D. It's not, you don't have your hands on somebody seeing how they're moving and how they're shaking. And that's why we have that particular service set up. And I have guys flying in from New York and all this stuff. And we do these assessments. And it's amazing how much better you can write a program when you've actually had your hands physically on somebody in a gym.
Yes.
Versus like even the remote shit is awesome and better than nothing, but it's still not nearly as much as showing up in person.
Yeah, what a great point. I mean, I just feel like you can't replace that. I've tried to do it virtually quite a bit. Again, putting someone through an assessment and looking at videos, but sometimes there is the translation piece where you need to get your hands on someone to get them to do a movement pattern the way you want them to do it, or maybe to actually see what's going on when, you're standing right beside them. Yeah.
So initially what I was reaching out and why we got into this conversation was the percentages for speedwork. So I know Dr. Mike had posted something on 50 and 60%. And I had basically messaged him back on it and said that what I had found over the last 15 or so years was that lowering that percentage down 10% was crucial. And the reason that I said that was because what I found is what Louis prescribed as 50 and 60% when we were at the gym made sense because our max effort days were in equipment. So a lot of times when we did max effort benching, we would be in bench shirts. We would have external equipment to protect the joints and help the muscles lift more weight. When I flipped over into raw in 2012 and went completely out of the gear, I started to realize that the synergistic effect from speed day to max day, the speed day was too heavy and it was actually detrimenting my max effort day 72 hours later. So when I lowered it down 10%, my bench shot back up immediately. And that's when I realized the idealistic amount was there. But as I started measuring with accelerometers, I started realizing that people at 50 and 60% were not very close to 1 meter per second, but down in 30 and 40, they were.
Yeah.
And if we maintained, so what I did was I would go 30%, which was about 1.1 meters per second. Then 35% was about 1.0 on the dot. Perfect. Then I would push the envelope with 5 more percent the next week and be about 0.9. Then I would take a deload week with German volume, and then I would come back and I would hit 30% again. And that wouldn't change until my max went up.
You hit it again with the same variations on that 4th week?
Well, I would do like dumbbells, kettlebells, bamboo bar. Those would change, but the rep scheme would be the same. 10 sets of 10, no neurological connection in the training. So I would do 10 sets of 10, but I wouldn't be like, getting all jacked up to do it. I'd just stay completely relaxed. I wouldn't even turn on hardcore music. I mean, I wasn't listening to like Sinead O'Connor, but like I wasn't listening to, like anything that was hard. It was everything to work through the motions and stay mellow. No psychological attachment. And I felt that a lot of people don't talk about that as a deload as well, is that deloading also needs to be mental. So if you walk into the gym and it's a deload day, you don't need metal and heavy music on. You need to learn how to work through these things without any neurological excitation, because that keeps you in what we call training maximums versus competition maximums.
Right.
So we see a lot in the high performance sector that people have a lot of adrenal fatigue. And it's because they try to tap into that every workout versus learning how to get super strong without having that neurological excitement at least every 4 weeks, so that the body has a chance to super compensate from the training of the prior weeks, right? So 30% is a tad bit light, 35% is optimal, 40% is right on the edge of being a little too heavy. Then you deload and then you start it over again, and then you just start waving your body up into a great position in order to help the max effort day 72 hours later. And then once you start seeing the max effort days, you start breaking, say you have 25 different ways to bench press. And every time you hit that next one 25 weeks later and you make a 10-pound PR, guaranteed your bench press is going up without actually doing the classical lift in its perfect sense.
Sure.
So 50 and 60% for raw lifters, in my opinion, and it might be because they're advanced, is going to be too detrimental to the central nervous system to recover every 72 hours, especially if you're drug free.
Yeah. So I think I definitely think that there's a lot to unpack with what you said. When I started, my initial online programming was for CrossFit gyms, was writing programs for CrossFit gyms. And at one point I had, 220, 225 CrossFit gyms that were using my program. So about 30 to 30,000 people a day were using the programming. And believe it or not, we were using Conjugate. And I don't know if Louis, like when I was at Westside at the times, I told him how many people that were using the Conjugate system. I don't think he fully understood what I was saying. But it's like, there is a lot of people that are being exposed to this, and I, obviously would not be doing this without you. And, going, reading all of his books and doing the special strengths, certificate and really all the stuff before that was an integral part of coming up with that kind of system. But, needless to say, this is what got challenging with dynamic effort in a group setting, or even in an individual setting, or the way we deliver programs now, is that number one, muscle fiber type across the board is, you might have someone that can't move fast with 30%, just because they've been an endurance athlete their whole life, and it doesn't even matter. They just don't have the connection there to be able to access type 2 muscle fibers. And maybe we can see some improvement there over time. But that's a limitation, number one. So muscle fiber type alone, limitation. Number two, the setup. I'm sure you see this, but the setup across the board is different anywhere you go. So you might have someone that drapes a band over the bar for their deadlifts. You might have someone that has a band deadlift setup like you do at your gym, where they can actually use 2 bands and get a decent amount of band tension. So what we're getting for band tension, I've tested this a number of ways as far as actually measuring the tension if you stand on a band versus if you have 2 bands. I mean, it's obviously, as you know, night and day.
Yeah.
So that's a limitation. And then you get into things like, are they setting up bands on dumbbells, 2 dumbbells, 1 dumbbell? Is it in a rack? Is it on pins? Is it on multiple pins? Are they draping it around the rack? Do they have tension in the bottom? Are they using chains? Well, I don't have bands, so I'm using chains. Well, what kind of chains? How much chains? So again, there's just like this list of things that you contend with, especially when you're delivering a program to, hundreds of people. And it's like, okay, how can I get this to play out well across the majority of those people? And for me, that's where I went to 40 to 50%, because 50 to 60 I've seen for most people is too high. But someone like you, Matt, maybe that's someone that's very explosive, like just a spark plug. They can move explosively. And maybe, their work capacity isn't great, but maybe they're super, super explosive.
Yeah.
With 50 to 60%, maybe they move it fast enough. And maybe
and something else you might want to hit on a little bit too is the fact that, do they get the max effort day and the speed day in every week consistently all the time? Because if they're missing max effort days because they got to go do something on Sunday, that's our heavy bench day, and they're not there, they can afford to train the speed work a little bit harder because they're going to have longer to recover. So there's all these factors, right?
There's all these factors. And I feel like the one thing that I've seen, well, one of the reasons I started doing program reviews is that if you can minimize the amount of confusion and make it just more accessible to the people that are using it. Now, maybe it's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect unless you and I are there coaching them and seeing it. It's not perfect, but how can I get it to a place where it's better? So what I do is I do 40 to 50. If you're using accommodating resistance, and I don't care what you're using, use anything. It's better than using nothing. Bands or chains. But if you're not, we're going to use anywhere from 50 to 60% with no accommodating resistance. And a lot of times I find that people are not using it. So again, it gets tricky. It's like, okay. And, I think a lot of people will see 50 to 60 straight away and they go, oh, it's not heavy enough.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that you deal with. But I think overall, if we can minimize the confusion, we can make so they get a better training effect. And obviously it synergizes a little bit better with what else we're doing.
Yeah.
But as you said, if they miss the session, which is another problem, right? So if we miss a session with conjugate, it's with a traditional conjugate split, that is, where we do 2 lower days, 2 upper days. It's more rigid. And that's why I started going to more full body training over the last 2.5 years, 3 years. I've gone more towards full body. So I have 2 training streams. One's full body and one's just more classic conjugate, where we do 2 lowers, 2 upper. But even the full body is still conjugate. Still train heavy. We still train fast. We still do GPP. We still do a ton of accessory work. We still train the aerobic system. There's still a lot of good things in there, but it's not set up into like, you're not going to see any power lifter using a full body. I mean, maybe you would if they only got 3 days a week to train, maybe. But I think for the most part, someone that's training for powerlifting meet or Olympic lifting or whatever, they're probably going to use more of a classic split.
Sure, absolutely. And the one big thing about speed work that I think probably should be hit on is, if you mess up something fast, you mess up something heavy. That's something that Louis used to talk about to us all the time. So speed work, even if it's set up slightly incorrectly, or maybe you don't have bands or chains, if you're making small errors with maybe what I prescribe 30 to 40 or what you prescribe 40 to 50, if you're making small errors, even if it's just free weights, guaranteed those errors are still exactly the same under heavy load. So what I find is if somebody can't keep their lats tight moving under high speed, they can't keep their lats tight under heavy weights.
Right.
So it's another way to make sure the technical ability is increasing on the other side of the force velocity curve, where we're hitting those very quick weights, almost fight or flight. There's not enough time to think about doing it perfect. It just happens perfect. And for most people, that takes time in order to develop. So what I find is that the same mistakes you see in speed work are the same mistakes you see in max work. It's just a slower speed.
Right.
And so it's a way to, if I don't have the equipment or maybe the plates, like I'm going to go speak at Swiss in Toronto in November, and we're gonna. The last time I've done that, I actually posted on Instagram today a picture of me teaching the bench press. If I have a stage where all I have is a plate, at 135, and I can't take somebody up to max to see their weakness, I'll make them do the dynamic effort method, and I can see their weaknesses right there.
Yeah.
Is their foot drive good? Are they staying tight? Are their abs tight? Is the bar moving in a straight line? Do they have any kind of weird things going on with their elbows flaring in or out? I mean, all of those things, if they're doing that with lightweights, you guarantee they're doing it with heavyweights.
Right. That's a great point.
Again, it comes down to being an assessment tool more than a training modality, if done correctly under the right supervision.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that I don't think a lot of people know about the conjugate system and Louis Simmons, but the focus on technique and, going for not getting greedy, going for a 5-pound PR, regardless of how good it might be. I see people that hit 5-pound PRs and it looks like a dynamic effort, speed rep, speed pull deadlift. And it's like, holy shit, man, that looked like a speed pull. And, ending, they hit a 5-pound PR. It's like Louis says, like hit a 5-pound PR. It's 5 pounds a month is 60 pounds a year. And I think that's something, leaving a little bit in the tank, which, now there's just so much research with like how close to failure you need to go. And obviously, training for maximal strength and performance, there are different things to consider, but there's just at this stage, I feel like there's too much. It's almost like too much research where it's almost a detriment to people.
And what we have to be careful with the research, and not that I'm saying any of that stuff is wrong, is the fact that the way the Western research model is set up is using intermediate and novices lifters. So, and again, I'm not being an ass, but it's easy to go from shit to suck. If you want to find out if a program really works, give it to somebody that's already a genetic potential and then make them better, because their line of doing things optimal is so much smaller. If it's good or bad, as you get better, that amount that you can screw up becomes less and less. In the beginning, anything makes you better.
Right.
So how do we know with hypertrophy or with these other studies that this is going to be the end all be all? Because most of them use recreationally trained athletes if they're lucky. So again, that's why we have to hold the Soviet system and like what Louis talked about all the time in higher regard than it even is today, because they didn't put out a paper saying something worked unless it was used with masterclass athletes.
I mean, all this stuff that Louis has said for so long is now being, you're seeing it more in research. And even the rest interval thing was a big thing for a while, resting for 3 minutes between every set you do and not doing supersets and allowing for complete nervous system recovery and yada, yada, yada. I mean, Louis, and now it's coming out that rest intervals, you can actually get the same training effect by training, 90 seconds to 2 minutes, which again, depends on what you're doing and who you are. If you're Matt Wenning, you're going for a max deadlift, then yes, might want to rest upwards of 3 to 5 minutes. But,
the big thing on that, hitting on that though, is am I training or am I testing?
Right. Exactly.
Now you have to ask that question, right? So yeah, that's a big issue. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing of it is that we only rested less than a minute for speed work. It was like every 50 seconds we were under the bar doing another set to get that accumulation of fatigue. So it kind of depends on what you're going for. But you look at the research, they were telling you rest in 3 minutes. And then I'm like, wait a minute. Now I know why people, when they see my workout, or maybe let's say you were an educated guy and doing a preview on my Train Heroic, which you did catch my rest periods, which I try to keep open because I find that guys that are less in shape might need a little bit longer rest than guys that are not. And so what I have found with my 300 plus firemen I train a week, that if I leave that open a little bit, some guys take 16, 18 minutes to warm up. Other guys can get it done in 11 and their heart rate's not even over 120.
Right.
And so I keep that kind of open because some people can get it done in 55 minutes. Other people, it takes an hour 10. But
those are the tough things about doing program reviews, is that if you don't do research ahead of time, sometimes, and honestly, Matt, like the stuff that I'm looking at is so bad that it's black or white. It's like, it's so bad, it's black or white. Like your program, Joe DeFranco's program, Mike Boyle's program was actually, I was kind of surprised. His was pretty solid. It was very,
I like
very well put together. And again, if someone is training for longevity, like it's a great program to use. But needless to say, there are a lot of programs that are just so overwhelmingly bad that there's really nothing even to say other
Yeah, I
than
know.
like, you're just absolutely smoking people and there's just no rhyme or reason to it.
Smoke and mirrors, man. But yeah, that's the big problem. I think is the dynamic method. You got to use it. You got to use it as an assessment tool as well as a speed tool. I think if you're by yourself training in a gym, whether you agree with your 40 to 50 or my 30 to 40, get an accelerometer, get a bar speed measure, and measure yourself. Maybe those variables are different for each person. The next thing you have to ask is what's the person's weakness? So if somebody is very explosive, but they don't have good maximum effort strength, they may need to raise those percentages on speed work to attack a little bit more specific to their particular weaknesses.
Yep.
That becomes another issue with that as well. Is like I've seen guys that can move 30 or 40% explosive because they were ex-athletes, but you get them up in the 50 to 60% range and now they look slow. And so
Yeah.
where's optimal? And I think the bar speed measuring tools are very important for individual differences, even on a daily basis. I mean, we know through research that your maximal strength can vary 10%, which is why, again, you probably saw in my workouts, I base things on rate of perceived exertion, which I know gets complex. But the problem is if you're 10% varying in strength on a daily basis, how do you base things on percentages and do it correctly over a long period of time? You can't.
Right. Yeah. And again, there's just so much to the individual. If someone's listening to this and they're using your program or my program, and maybe the percentage feels too light or too heavy, then go up or down. Go 3 to 5%, go up or down. Like we're writing the program the best we can for a lot of people. And you know what? The level of individualization is so specific to you that I can't see that. So you have to just, and I feel like half the problem that I see, and I don't know if you see this too with a lot of people that use your training, but people overthink things. They major in the minor, like they're asking questions that just don't, in the scheme of things, don't matter. What matters is, you want to know what matters? I get this question all the time, like, oh, can I add some more direct calf and arm work? And my first question is, have you been using this program for 5 days a week for the last 12 weeks consistently? And are you using nutrition? Like, is your nutrition supporting your goals? And usually no one answers. And if you've done the program for the last 12 weeks and you have not missed a session and you still feel like you need to add some direct arm work, then fine, go ahead. But most times people are not, they're majoring in the minor. They haven't been consistent for 12 weeks to you and I, that's nothing, right? Really, it should be years. Like, have you been consistent for the last year on this program? Because life is just such where, day to day, we've got things that are changing. And I think that you need to be, number one, you just need to be consistent.
Yep.
Now, if you don't get the dynamic effort right, or maybe you don't use enough chain or band tension, I don't care. What I care is if you've been doing the program consistently for a long stretch of time. That's what I care about, And I feel like that's, if people just removed all of the overthinking and all of the just second guessing and they just did the program, good things would happen.
Yeah, that's the problem. Is I think people are they're so impatient, and then they have so less mindset on the consistency part of exactly what you're saying. My best clients, and I'm not being a dick on this, but my best clients came in, and this is back probably when I was writing workouts for you. I had a guy named Rob that came in to see me. He had just got done with testicular cancer and chemo. The dude couldn't drag 2 plates. This guy's a 350-pound guy, couldn't drag two plates on a sled for 40 yards without puking. That's how bad a shape he was in. No shit. And he said, man, I really want to train with you and get better. And I said, okay, you're going to work out with me for 2 years. Don't ask me a fucking question for 2 years. And then let's see where you're at. 2 years later, he pulled 700 pounds and he lost 50 pounds. And I'm just like,
that's a great story.
But as you well know, he's special, meaning he just listens and just does what he's told and doesn't focus on the minor things. He gets the big things done and he shows up every day for 2 years and everything changed the way he wanted it to change.
Those are the people that get results, the people that I just mentioned. And for those of you, I said this a lot, for those of you listening, if you're that person, it's time to change your ways because you're never going to get results. Those people never get, I see the same people, the same questions. They never get better. There's the people that go to the commercial gym and they're doing the same weights year after year. And eventually they start going backwards. they never get results.
Yeah, I know.
And you know what? It's not just in the gym. I mean, we're talking about life here. Like you probably don't get results in other things either. And because you're in your own way. So get the fuck out of your own way and just show up and get it done. It's really that simple. And I get, social media is just like such an entertainment show that people want to overcomplicate it. It doesn't need to be that way. You just need to be consistent on a good program. And obviously don't eat like an asshole. I mean, that goes without saying, but be consistent for a year straight and see what happens.
Both me and you figured it out a long time ago. It's all about consistency, and it's all about being able to make sure that, both you and I in our programs, regardless of what small differences there may be, the program, we've done the thought process for you. We've already been through these particular avenues and realized that these were dead end roads. These exercises probably weren't optimal for whatever reason. It's just follow it. We've already got the mindset down for you to get it straightened out, as long as you stick with it over the consistent amount of time. And that's the problem, is I think it's just impatience we see in society, even in the fitness industry. Everybody's trying to outmarket everybody else by getting it done faster. Well, if you walk 10 years into the woods, you got to walk 10 years out of the woods. It's not like you can't fix 10 years of shit in 2 days. You know what I mean? So I think that's a big problem that we see in the field. And average person with very little education in physical training or resistance training, they're just overwhelmed with so much shit. They don't know what to believe. And I think that becomes a problem with YouTube. I mean, you're highly educated. I'm highly educated. DeFranco's been in this field for 30 years. Mike Boyle's been in the field longer than me and you've been alive. These guys, although we might have disagreements, we all probably have your best interest in mind, because you don't last in this field more than 2 decades if you haven't been able to prove your worth, right? It's the people that just show up and automatically they got some new crazy thing going on. And then 2 years later, they're gone. It's funny because, I live in Columbus, Ohio, and the Arnold Classic is what got me introduced to Louis, but it also introduced me to the circular effect of the fitness industry, as far as when you go to the expo, where all these companies have these new supplements, and it was the same supplement 20 years ago with a different brand name. Nothing's changing. It's just a different way to package it. And when you have been in the field long enough, you see the rotation, because, it's a whole new crowd of bodybuilders and people interested in lifting every 3 to 4 years. It's a different crowd, because that crowd decided and gave up or wasn't consistent. And, and for most people, unfortunately, what we treat as a profession is a hobby to them, which I find is another issue. Again, you've seen probably with people wanting to pay for your services. Well, why do I do that when I can get this for free? Because if it's free, it's probably not for you. And it probably nobody wanted to put any time or effort to make it right. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's interesting, because I think probably for you, Matt, and I know for me, it's the same, that all the stuff that got me to this point right now was unfortunately, free. All the articles, I mean, all the talks that you did. I mean, I found you from an NSCA talk that you did, right? Which, if I watch an hour and it was over an hour, I watched an over an hour talk. I mean, obviously that is, if I listen to you talk for an hour, I'm probably pretty bought into what you're saying, and things are resonating with me. So that for me was writing articles for T Nation and Elite FTS, and doing various speaking things. That stuff is again a way for people to test out whether or not what I'm saying is valid. Right. And without that, I wouldn't be able to sell digital products and obviously have a training subscription with a lot of people on it. And I would say the same probably goes for you. But at the end of the day, we're living in a day and age where people can get stuff for basically like $1 a day. You can get training, you can get great training, even less than that. And you can get world-class training from people like me and you for next to nothing. You probably spend more going to Starbucks, right? But the individualization piece, obviously that's up for you. There's so much shit out there that is like you said, smoke and mirrors. It's marketing. It looks sexy. I see this stuff and I'm like, they package it so well. And you know what? All the power to them, because I think that that's a skill in and of itself. I don't have that skill. My skill is to just tell you and say, hey, this is what it is. Yeah. I'm a no nonsense kind of guy. what I say is legit. You can test everything I'm saying with, I mean, I have over 500 articles. Go read any one of my articles. Collectively, there's like 3 years worth of free programming on the internet. I'm sure probably same for you, but is that the thing that you can do for the rest of your life? I'm about you being able to train, be on the last training program for the rest of your life and not have to go program hard, because like you and I just said, it's you doing the same thing for a long stretch of time. If you walk 10 years in the woods, you got to walk 10 years out of the woods. You can't do it overnight. I love that analogy. I think that's perfect, because you do need to stick to something. And I used to even say at the beginning, like, just get on my program for 8 weeks and see what happens. And you know what? I do think that that's true, because I do think that, with the day and age of like free trials, it's like people are just like grabbing these free trials and trying this, trying that. And you just perpetuate this cycle of program hopping, which is just such a huge disorder.
We actually stopped all that. We stopped all the free trials, because what we started to realize is that people were just program hopping. And it wasn't the fact that we weren't retaining them. It was the fact that they weren't being consistent enough to actually see anything. I mean, what's a week, right? And so I find that's
I'm in the same boat with free trials. I feel like it's, you do retain some people, but what can you see in a week?
Mm-hmm.
If you're just looking at it, people are just looking at it and they're not actually doing it.
Yeah.
I've got other places you can go. I'm putting out an opt-in, a free week. You want a free week of program? I'm happy to give you a free week of program. You're probably not going to do it. You need to get on a real program and do it for a stretch of time, Well,
and you gotta have a little skin in the game.
Right.
That's the other problem with it as well. I mean, if there's no skin in the game, then there's no way to do it. So I actually had a talk with them on Trainer Road, the guys that run the app, and they're getting away from the free trials too. They say it's not a good transition, because people just don't have any skin. So they just jump. And then the next thing you know, they're frustrated because they didn't get what they wanted, but they didn't do anything for long enough to see the results. You know what I mean? And so that can be a huge issue as well.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's funny. I actually got free trials. I did free trials for 1 week out of the month. So the last week of the month, and we let our mailing list know, hey, if you want a free trial, you can get it for the next 7 days. But after that, we're in the same boat, because you can't see anything, can't do anything. And again, people just abuse it. They don't actually stick to the program. And the reality is they got to stick to the program if they're going to go anywhere with it.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I think we've covered the speed work. The max work is one of those things I think you have to adjust with your training and your age, depending on your goals. But, the big thing is a lot of people don't realize is that max effort work really creates very marginal, if zero, hypertrophy. It's all neurological adaptation. Mm-hmm. So for women out there that like, well, I don't want to go heavy because I don't want to get too big. Well, in reality, going heavy kind of blunts getting bigger and makes you stronger through the central nervous system. So really it's volume in the incorrect areas, basically putting on what I consider junk hypertrophy and not focusing on specialized weak points is usually the big problem with what people have, is this facade that max effort work is not for them because they don't want to be strong. Well, everything comes back down to being based on your maximal strength. So if I want to do speed and we're basing it on percentages, who's going to get more results? The guy that can do speed work with 225 or the guy that can do speed work with 135? Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it comes down to that you're eventually going to have to get stronger. And what I find with female athletes is as they get stronger, they actually just get leaner.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I'm sure you do the same thing over the last so many years.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. I feel like there's so many misconceptions with that stuff. And of course, if it was so easy to get big and gain muscle, I mean, guys wouldn't be where they're at. There would be a lot more jacked dudes out there. That's obviously not the case.
Right.
Matt, what I really wanted to hear about from you, I know you spent a lot of time with Charles Poliquin, and I trained with the strength coach I had in high school and college was a Poliquin guy. He actually was out in Arizona with Poliquin and did a whole internship with him back when he was becoming a coach.
Yeah.
And so he did a lot of work with Poliquin. We used to use his biosignature, his 11 site test. I've done, I don't know, maybe 500. I've tested 500 people.
I just did 5 or 6 of them yesterday.
Yeah, I think he was saying you had to do at least 1,000 to be accurate. But needless to say, I've got a lot of experience with Poliquin, and obviously someone like you that has spent time with him. I'd love to just hear maybe you talk about your time with him and maybe some of the stories, because
he was a lot like us. I mean, he was a no frills guy. If he saw something that he didn't believe in or didn't think was correct or was leading down the wrong path for someone, he would be very upfront about what that was. I know that when we did those seminars together overseas for a couple of years, he had a lot of crazy tricks up his sleeves. Like he had such a broad background in like guasha and like body fat percentages, and he had a huge picture of the entire scenery versus just what was going on right in front of his eyes. I remember him being one of the first coaches that would be like, somebody would come to him. I think it was James Harrison. We were in Arizona and he was doing a biosignature class, and I'm out there helping with the class. And Harrison comes out and Harrison starts asking about all this training stuff. And Charles just looks at him straight up and was like, well, if you're only sleeping 5 hours a day because you're out at the clubs or doing whatever, he's like, that's not going to be conducive for any of these questions you're asking. Mm-hmm. And he's talking to a very highly paid NFL guy,
right,
basically saying, hey, your lifestyle is more important now than what you're doing with training. Mm-hmm. And that's really like was a light bulb for me as far as like not my own personal stuff, because I was always really good about going to bed and I had to eat a lot to weigh 315 to be as strong as I was. But watching him look at a full circular picture of recovery, training, nutrition, stress management, and that's when I saw it actually be utilized. Me and you have both read about those individual areas, but you hardly ever see anybody put it all together in one piece. Mm-hmm. And Charles was really good at doing that. And his information was so vast on so many different areas that really didn't revolve directly around strength training, but aided in strength training's ability to perform. And I think that becomes a lifelong pursuit of trying to be at least knowledgeable in 5 or 6 other disciplines around your discipline that has indirect response to it. And I think that's what's interesting you find with, not only did I read a lot of Charles's books that he had in his house, which I wish I had, but a lot of the books that Louis had as well, you go into reading into them and the first 3 chapters are about lifestyle. They're not even about like the lifting and the percentages and the exercises and all this. It's like you have to be healthy before you decide that you want to be strong, or any other vice versa. If you want to be great at this, great at that. And I think that was the first coach that I had seen actually live that with his clients. And so for me, it definitely opened up a door to realize that, with my master's in biomechanics and being with Louis, and we were always talking about dynamic effort method and max effort method and exercise selection, it was almost like, holy shit, I didn't forget about these areas, but I never understood how to apply them in a full spectrum. And it's hard because I try to use this. I mean, I'll give you a case in point. Yesterday, I worked with 8 fire stations, and I try to bring them this holistic approach to everything, but it's hard. You walk in and in their mess hall where they eat, they got shitty bread. They got all this other shit.
Yeah.
Fried foods are everywhere. People from the public bringing cookies and cakes and all this shit they shouldn't be eating because they think they're being nice to the guys.
Yeah.
But in reality, they're just putting shit in front of people that have no self-control. So we create this huge balance or this huge problem of society wants to live this way, but we need to be this way in order to perform our job, especially in a fire department sense. And Charles was really good at managing a lot of that. Mm-hmm. And not to say that all of his energy was insanely positive. He was kind of one of those guys that would make you feel bad to make you change.
Yeah,
it's the same thing with Louis.
Right.
I'm sure he didn't make you feel great that your glutes weren't turning on. He probably said, and sissy, your glutes turning on. That's why you can't deadlift 500 or whatever, instead of being like, oh, and I think the problem is most people, they want a coach that pats them on the back and gives them all positive feedback, and I got into an argument with a fire crew yesterday. I was like, I'm not going to give you praise for deadlifting your body weight. Like, that's just, I'm sorry. That's not me.
That's a basic, that's a basic requirement.
And Charles would have been the exact same way, probably way worse.
Yeah.
And I think it's they don't realize, they think you're being an asshole. But in reality, what I saw with Charles was he was just telling them the truth. And a lot of people didn't want to hear it. Mm-hmm. And I think he could have been, I think what hurt him as far as his outreach, because guys like you and me and a lot of the handful of the upper level echelon guys knew of Charles and knew of his work, but to the general public, still a lot of people don't know who that was. I think what hurt him was he just went through a divorce or two that separated his means and his ability to have more outreach, because Holcomb Group is one of his ex-wife's things, and she won that in the divorce, and then he had to start back over with Strength Sensei, and that kind of knocked him down. It's just a weird scenario. It's like, I don't know that there'll ever be a time which guys like Louis and guys like Charles and guys like Fred Hatfield, the information is cyclic because nobody remembers what they did after they died. Mm-hmm. Like all this work that Louis has done in the last 30 years, I mean, hardly anybody talks about him anymore. He's only been dead for 2 years.
Yeah.
It's like it's all disappeared. So honestly, in my opinion, I've talked about this before, training was smarter when guys like Charles and Louis and them were the only ones that had the right to write articles and put things in magazines for guys like you and me and our generation to read. Mm-hmm. Now everybody has a voice, but who really has the knowledge to really be able to help anybody? And so it's convoluted and it's all mixed and matched. But back when Louis wrote in Powerlifting USA, there were people that were just members of Powerlifting USA to get the magazine just to read Louis's articles. But if Louis wouldn't have been strong himself and created champions himself, nobody would have asked him to write those articles.
Right.
You see what I mean? And Charles,
for sure.
Team USA and Team Canada, and had all these accolades with these massive athletes. But as soon as he died in 2018, it was like it almost just disappeared again. And there's only fragments of it. And it's like I feel that other generations and other specificities, not just training, but like everything else, I feel like they retain their knowledge better and they start increasing, like the medical field, for example. What we were doing in the 50s, we learned from and advanced in the 60s and then advanced in the 70s. That doesn't happen in strength training. Mm. It really just disappears every generation, and then it gets reinvented like it's some new wheel, when in reality, that was happening 50 years ago. It's just everybody forgot about it.
Right. Well, and that's why I feel, even like YouTube is a good example. This past year for me, I'm like, I'm going to go hard on YouTube, because YouTube videos, as you know, you probably have videos that you made 3 years ago that people are commenting on it today. They're mm-hmm. seeing that stuff from 3 years ago. Whereas Instagram, a post I did last week is gone. It's dead.
Yeah.
Right. So the information is gone. So, and the same thing with articles. Like I started reading T Nation articles back in 2004, and it was Louis, Dave Tate, Charles Poliquin, Joe DeFranco. Those are the people that I initially learned from. And I always say that I learned more from reading the daily article on that site than I learned in getting a master's in exercise science. And that's the truth. That's the honest to God truth. And hopefully my doctorate's not the same way, but I think that the practical, what you learn from reading that stuff, and then you have these ideas and you take them and you go try them. You go play with them. Oh, I saw, this basic skeleton of a max effort training session. I'm going to go try this and see how it goes. Oh, well, this didn't go so well. So you learn these things from that. And, from Poliquin, I learned about the 6-12-25 method. And I've written a bunch of articles for T Nation on it to try to kind of bring that back and give him credit for it. And also,
and think about how many people, when you did that, never even saw it.
They never heard of it. This is from Charles Poliquin. And then there'd be people that'd be like, you stole this. I'm like, well, I said it's from Charles Poliquin. There are some things I actually did different with it than he did. I thought that the tempo part of it was very extreme. People would be overly sore and not able to recover. From what I saw from doing it as Charles wrote it, but needless to say, it's something that he came up with it. And
that's the same thing I get blamed for too with Louis. Oh, you just copied Louis's West Side Conjugate, system. And I'm like, that's absolutely true. What Louis and I had disagreements on was the amount of recovery needed. Mm-hmm. So as I started to attack, Dr. Kramer was my professor as an undergrad. He was an adjunct professor with Dr. Zatsiorsky at Penn State.
Wow, what a professor to
have. Right. Mm-hmm. So he gave me his personal email, and I started shooting back and forth with Zatsiorsky. He goes, you might want to ask Verkhoshansky about some of these questions, but the problem is he can't speak English, but his daughter can. So Zatsiorsky gives me Verkhoshansky's, Natalia, his daughter's email, and she starts translating for me. And I asked him, so I sent him a 1 month template of what we were doing at Westside Barbell with Louis. And he goes, where's your deloads? And I was like, well, we don't really deload because flip and flop and move exercises so much we don't need deloads. I'm trying to explain why we don't need them. And he goes, you need at least 3 to 4 days down every month in order for all of that training to absorb itself and go to the next level. So I bring this, and I basically show it to Louis, and Louis like, yeah, fucking, whatever. He's full of shit. And I'm like, I'm going to listen to him. And so you don't have to if you don't want to, but I'm going to. Well, the next meet I go to, I'm already like 7th best in the world. I go from 7th best to 3rd best in 8 months just because I'm recovering. And so now everybody's like, what are you doing different, Matt? And I'm like, dude, I'm taking 3-4 days off, or at least really easy every month to make sure that the 3.5 weeks of training, which if you look at those Russian cycles, there's multiple books that tell you that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was what was weird with Louis is he liked to pick up what he read, but he only kept what he thought grabbed himself at that time. And he missed, sometimes he could miss the big picture. And because I had a high level degree, I was reading the in between the lines shit. And as soon as Burkashansky said that, he started giving me page numbers out of his book, like his periodization books. And I'm reading it, I'm like, son of a bitch, I missed that paragraph.
Wow.
I'm sure he did.
Well,
too.
I mean, it's so dense. I mean, if you read super training, or any science of practice strength training, science of practice strength is a pretty easy book to read, but super training is not, as you know.
Yeah, it's just an index.
I mean, it is just an index. And I think that's, wow, that's an incredible story though. I feel like, and
so,
what would you say for regular people? Like, obviously you guys are elite level powerlifters. Do you think that logic would still apply to someone that maybe is just training for general fitness?
I think that deloads apply not because of a general fitness aspect, because of passive tissue adaptation to training we know is slower than the actual active tissue. So even if your goal isn't to be the most elite lifter in the world, I still think it's a good idea for ligaments, tendons, and cartilage to have a resilience point or a downward time in order to let it lymphatically catch up. So I believe that is important for no matter what sport you're in. Just because if you're doing anything that's impactful or axial loading or neurologically detrimental, if you're not taking those days a month, especially if you're consistent, if you're not taking those days to let everything catch up, I think it will play bad for you 3 to 5, maybe 8 years down the road, which we all know is about when you should be hitting about your peak is around 10 years, 10,000 hours or roughly. And people like to discredit that, but I think it's a very good starting point for the knowledge to give people a long-term mindset. Like once you hit 10 years, 10,000 hours, you start, if you're really listening to what your body's telling you and you're reading and trying to understand what you're doing, you're going to start having an idea of what's right and what's wrong by 10 years. At 15, you're probably pretty good at it. And by 20, 25 years of really putting your head down, you're probably an expert in the world in what you're doing. And so for me, I think the deloads are very important, but I didn't learn that until I was already nearly a world record holder. Imagine if I would have learned that 3 to 5 years prior. But there was also an advantage to the way Louis did things as well. Every day you went into that gym, it was a competition. Everybody was out for blood.
Which is another level of stress that's even higher than just me going to train right now.
Oh, yeah. And again, if you're trying to break world records, that's the type of environment you're going to have to be in. So it's hard to tell guys that are knopping at the bit to squat 1,000 pounds every time they walk into the gym that they need to back off a couple of days. Maybe they wouldn't have listened and Louis just said, fuck it, I'm not doing it anyway.
Yeah.
So again, there's all these factors involved, but I think if everything's perfect, deloads are absolutely needed in the training for the passive tissue to catch up to what the active tissue is putting stress on.
Yeah, that's a great point. We use a lot of the one thing I've seen over the last couple of years is that doing more aerobic work, longer duration of zone 2 work, cyclical, you can mix in various things to keep it interesting, but doing more cyclical zone 2, 60 to 70% max heart rate at a sustained pace. For us, it was always like around 90 minutes. And now we're more towards 2 to 3 hours, which is actually supported by, there's a lot of literature on that as well that supports that. Yeah. Per week. And, again, it's a tough thing on my conjugate program. We do about 2 hours a week. On my full body program, we do about 2 to 3 hours, depending on, how many days you're doing. If you're doing 3 days, there's 3 days of strength training, 3 days of conditioning. If you're doing all 3 days, then you'll get it in. But what I've seen is that, it has been doing 30-minute sessions was not enough.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, especially for males, it does take more to get the return on investment. I see that in research, women don't need as much, which great for them. But for me, what I've seen, even looking at things like my resting heart rate and heart rate variability score, that it does take a little bit more. And of course, there's just no way around it. It's not sexy. It's not fun. It's
Yeah.
definitely not going to get likes on social media, but it is a necessary means, and it does help really bridge the gap. But it really facilitates. I mean, if you think about just the physiological process of recovery and just restoring energy and even being able to drive more blood to working tissues while you're training. All that stuff does happen via the aerobic system and having better cardiac
Sure.
output.
Well, and again, it's why GPP is so important. It was my missing link with winning warmups.
Mm,
So I go to my first all raw meet in 2013. I'd already been 600 raw, maybe 6 weeks prior. I'm going to the meet, and the world record total is 22:02 by Dan Kovacs. And I'm like, well, I can fucking beat that because every third week I do raw squats anyway.
mhm.
So I go to the meet and I squat right around 780. So I don't even know it's a walkout meet
Yeah.
because I'm training in a monolift. So I have to walk it out. So I walk it out, whatever. I get to my bench and I only hit like 578. I'm like, what? I try like 610, which that training cycle I'd done 585 for a triple. So
Mhm.
a 610 was pretty safe.
Yeah.
I get there, I have no gas left. I'm toast because I don't train squats and deadlifts and bench all in the same day.
Yeah.
I'm driving home, and my first inclination as a meathead is I wasn't strong enough that day. And then as I keep digging, I'm like, maybe I wasn't fit enough after the squats to kick my ass. And then I
Yeah.
didn't have enough energy in the bench. So initially the winning warm-up was a development of pre-fatigue in order to when I got to the bench press, the squat couldn't affect it.
Right.
Then as I learned, it was actually helping soft tissue and increasing GPP, and then getting to the point where I had so much local endurance in those particular muscle groups that a meet where I had 2 or 3 hours in between each event was like forever. And so again, work capacity, like what you're getting at with the cardio, is a way to do it with specific weight training, which is the winning warm up. It's constituted around 140, 145 BPM. That's maintained between 12 and 14 minutes with 300 reps of consistent workload that is just constantly moving with no rest. Once you get adapted to that, and then you got a 3 5 minute rest before your main lift, it actually should potentiate those muscles to allow you to lift heavier weights safer, which it did. And that's when I realized that the work capacity, both anaerobically and aerobically, was hugely important once I got the gear off. And it was something I wish I could have talked to Louis about, because I think because the guys were in gear, he never saw that happen.
Yeah.
But with
Yeah.
completely raw guys, he would have seen the advantage of it over time.
Well, yeah, it's everything between that time between your lifts is all aerobic. And even people say like, well, a sprinter really doesn't need to train the aerobic system. It's all ATP PC system. Well, it's like, well, but they're not doing them. They're not doing one. They're doing one, and then how much time is there? That's the aerobic system. All the energy is coming from the aerobic system. The aerobic system does replenish ATP, so
Right.
there is an aerobic component to it, whether you want to believe it or not. I mean, American football, for all intents and purposes, is very anaerobic. However, there's only 45 seconds between plays.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with dynamic effort. Dynamic effort is, there's an aerobic element to that. You have a better aerobic system. That's why I would do dynamic effort with really strong guys that had no work capacity, and I would crush them. Doing a set of box squats every 45 seconds, they'd be crushed. After doing 3 sets, they're literally on the floor. It's like, hey, we got, 7 more sets to go. But they just didn't have the aerobic development, or the GBP to be able to do that. And I think that's one thing when I went to Westside is, I think that Louis was such a great conditioning coach, and no one would credit him with that. I mean, the wheelbarrow, even pulling sleds for a mile. I mean, never saw anyone pull a sled.
Squat marches.
Yeah, belt squat marching for 5 minutes. What do you think 5 minutes is?
I watched him do his plyo swing with moderate, very light weights he would do sets of 2 minutes.
Right.
He just not jump hard, but he would just boom, 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 boom. You know what I mean? He would do all kinds of shit like that for way longer than what people thought.
Right.
Which is a huge issue. But work capacity, or GPP, general physical preparedness, is the baseline to which all those athletic endeavors are
Mhm.
set. So if you don't have a good baseline, you can't recover from more extraneous workouts. So when you go into a peaking phase, you're already at a deficit.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
Right.
Well, Matt, I think we could probably
Yeah.
talk all day, but I think we got quite a bit
Yeah, man.
quite a bit here to post for people and maybe get some good questions. I think last thing I'll say is, for people that are watching, drop us some comments.
Yeah.
Let us know what your questions are with this. I mean, I think the Charles Poliquin stuff for me, I would love to know more about that. I mean, maybe for you, Matt, maybe that's a good YouTube video, because I certainly would watch that. I'd love to hear more about Poliquin. I feel like exactly what you said. People are forgetting about these things, and I think it's very important, because without Charles Poliquin, without Louis Simmons, without some of these great people that we've had the privilege to learn from,
Yeah.
who knows what the conversation would be like.
Yeah. I'll shoot a video for you and give you a shout out on it, man.
Yeah,
So this idea is from Jason Brown.
I love it, man.
Right,
yeah,
brother.
man. So that was great. It was great chatting, and I'm sure we'll chat more soon.
Yeah. See you soon, buddy.
All right.